The crimson sunset over Colorado's Sangre de Cristo Mountains painted the sky like spilled blood across the heavens, casting long shadows over the mining town of Cedar Ridge, where Margaret Maggie O'Brien stood on the porch of her modest boarding house, watching strangers in expensive suits move through her town like vultures circling carrion. The 42-year-old widow had spent 3 years trying to rebuild her life after the cave-in that claimed her husband Seamus and 12 other miners. But the vultures had finally come to finish what the mountain had started. Maggie's weathered hands gripped the porch railing as she observed the delegation from the Rocky Mountain Coal Company making their rounds through Cedar Ridge, their polished boots and Eastern manners marking them as outsiders who saw only profit where she saw home. Her coal-black hair, streaked with premature silver from grief and hard labor, was pulled back in a practical bun that couldn't quite hide the intelligence burning in her green eyes that had seen too much death and learned too many secrets to ever be fooled by smooth-talking corporate men. The boarding house behind her was more than just a business. It was the heart of Cedar Ridge's Irish community, a place where miners and their families gathered to share news, plan resistance, and preserve the culture they had carried across an ocean to these unforgiving mountains. What the coal company men didn't know was that beneath the boarding house lay something far more valuable than the coal they sought to extract, a network of tunnels that had been dug not by mining companies, but by desperate people seeking freedom and safety in a hostile land. "Maggie," came a voice from behind her, soft with the musical accent of County Cork. Her closest friend, Bridget Murphy, emerged from the kitchen carrying a pot of tea and the worried expression of someone who had seen the strangers and understood their purpose. "Those fancy men have been asking questions about you specifically. They know about the property Seamus left behind." Maggie accepted the steaming cup gratefully, her mind already working through the implications of corporate interest in her small holdings. Seamus had owned not just their house and the boarding house business, but also several acres of apparently worthless scrubland on the outskirts of townland that geological surveys had recently revealed sat atop one of the richest coal veins in Colorado territory. "What kind of questions?" Maggie asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Bridget's face darkened with the anger of someone who had watched too many of her people be cheated by those with power and money. "They're asking about your legal right to the property, about whether you have any family who might contest a sale, about how much money it would take to convince you to relocate somewhere more suitable for a woman in your circumstances." The phrase carried the condescending tone that Maggie had learned to recognize and despise during her years of fighting the mining company for compensation after Seamus's death. These men saw widows as obstacles to be removed rather than human beings with rights and feelings, inconveniences that could be solved with a combination of legal pressure and financial inducement. But what they didn't understand was that Margaret O'Brien was not just any widow. She was the daughter of Patrick Caldwell, one of the most successful tunnel engineers in Ireland, before the potato famine drove him to America. More importantly, she was the keeper of knowledge that had been passed down through 3 generations of her family knowledge about underground construction, hidden passages, and the kind of engineering that could make mountains themselves into weapons against those who sought to exploit them. As if summoned by her thoughts, the strangers she had been watching approached her boarding house with the confident stride of men who believed money could solve any problem. The leader was a tall, thin man in his 50s, with silver hair and the kind of pale complexion that spoke of a life spent in boardrooms rather than under open skies. His expensive suit was perfectly tailored, but his eyes held the cold calculation of someone who measured human worth in terms of quarterly profits. "Mrs. O'Brien, I presume," the man said, removing his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "My name is Edmund Blackthorne, Senior Vice President of the Rocky Mountain Coal Company. I wonder if we might have a word about your property situation." Maggie set down her teacup and studied the corporate delegation with the calm assessment her father had taught her to use when evaluating potential threats. 3 men in addition to Blackthorne, 2 who had the look of lawyers or accountants, and 1 whose scarred hands and watchful eyes marked him as someone accustomed to solving problems through violence rather than negotiation. "Mr. Blackthorne," Maggie replied, her Irish accent lending musical authority to her words. "If you're here about buying my land, I'm afraid you've wasted a trip. The property isn't for sale at any price." Blackthorne's smile was as cold as mountain snow in January. "Miss O'Brien, I think you may be misunderstanding the nature of our visit. The Rocky Mountain Coal Company has acquired mineral rights to this entire valley through legal agreements with the territorial government. We're not here to make you an offer. We're here to inform you of the new circumstances that affect your property." The statement hit Maggie like a physical blow, but years of dealing with corporate lawyers had taught her not to show weakness in the face of legal intimidation. "Mr. Blackthorne, my husband's property comes with a clear title that predates any mineral agreements your company might have made. I'm sure your lawyers have explained the difference between surface rights and mineral rights." One of Blackthorne's companions, a nervous man with wire-rimmed spectacles, stepped forward with a leather portfolio. "Mrs. O'Brien, I'm afraid the situation is more complex than you realize. Recent territorial legislation has clarified that coal extraction rights supersede existing property claims when the coal deposits extend beneath multiple parcels. Your land falls within the boundaries of our extraction zone." The legal language was designed to confuse and intimidate, but Maggie had spent 3 years fighting the coal company over compensation claims and had learned to recognize bureaucratic double-talk when she heard it. What they were describing was essentially legalized theft, using complex laws to strip property owners of rights they had held for years. "Gentlemen," Maggie said with dangerous quiet, "I think you should know that I'm not the simple Irish widow you seem to think I am. My family has been dealing with powerful men who try to steal from the poor for more generations than your company has existed. If you want my land, you'll have to take it through honest legal proceedings, not through intimidation and fraudulent claims." Blackthorne's facade of corporate courtesy finally slipped, revealing the ruthless predator beneath. "Mrs. O'Brien, I had hoped we could resolve this matter through civilized negotiation. But if you insist on being difficult, I should warn you that the Rocky Mountain Coal Company has resources and connections that extend far beyond what a boarding house operator in a small mining town might be able to resist." The threat was clear enough, but Maggie had faced threats before from mine supervisors who refused to implement safety measures, from territorial officials who denied compensation claims, from landlords who tried to evict families whose breadwinners had died in company mines. She had learned that the only effective response to institutional bullying was strategic resistance, backed by superior knowledge and careful preparation. "Mr. Blackthorne," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "I think you should know that the Irish have a long tradition of dealing with powerful oppressors who think their money and connections make them untouchable. Sometimes those oppressors discover that mountains hold more secrets than they realize." As the corporate delegation prepared to leave, The scarred man who had remained silent throughout the conversation gave Maggie a look that made her blood run cold. She recognized the type, a professional enforcer, who had probably learned his trade in the industrial wars of Pennsylvania or West Virginia, where coal companies used violence as routinely as they used legal contracts. "Mrs. O'Brien," Blackthorne said as he replaced his hat, "you have 48 hours to reconsider your position. After that, the Rocky Mountain Coal Company will be forced to pursue other methods of resolving this property dispute. I trust you'll make the decision that best serves your long-term interests." As the corporate men walked away, their expensive boots clicking against the wooden sidewalk, Maggie felt the familiar mixture of rage and determination that had sustained her through the darkest period of her life. But this time, she also felt something else, a cold anticipation that came from finally having an opportunity to use knowledge that had been hidden for too long. Bridget emerged from the boarding house, where she had been listening through an open window, her face reflecting the concern of someone who understood the gravity of what they had just witnessed. "Maggie, these men are different from the local supervisors and territorial officials we've dealt with before. They have the kind of resources that can make people disappear." Maggie nodded grimly, her mind already working through the preparations that would be necessary for the conflict that was now inevitable. "Bridget, do you remember the stories my father used to tell about the old country, about how our people survived when the English tried to starve us out or drive us from our homes?" I remember. He said the land itself was your greatest ally if you knew how to use it." Maggie's smile held secrets that went back 3 generations and across an ocean to the mountains of Ireland, where her ancestors had learned to turn the earth itself into a weapon against oppression. "Tonight, after the boarding house is closed, I'm going to show you something that my father showed me when we first came to these mountains. Something that will make Mr. Blackthorne wish he had chosen a different widow to threaten." As the sun disappeared behind the peaks of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold, Maggie O'Brien began the preparations for a battle that would determine not just her own survival, but the future of every family in Cedar Ridge who refused to be driven from their homes by corporate greed. The coal company men thought they were dealing with a helpless widow whose only weapons were stubbornness and sentiment. They were about to discover that some widows carried knowledge that could move mountains literally. Deep beneath the boarding house, in tunnels that had been dug by desperate hands seeking freedom and safety, lay the key to a resistance that would shake the Rocky Mountain Coal Company to its very foundations. The question was whether Maggie O'Brien had the courage to use weapons that her father had prayed would never be necessary. The answer to that question would echo through the mountains of Colorado like the rumble of approaching thunder, reminding powerful men that some people knew how to fight back, and some secrets were more dangerous than any amount of money or corporate influence. "Hey everyone, you can already feel the tension building here in Cedar Ridge. Maggie's clearly not your typical frontier widow, and that mention of secret tunnels has got me on the edge of my seat. Where are you watching from tonight? Drop a comment below and let me know what you think Maggie's planning. And if you're already hooked on this tale of Irish determination versus corporate greed, don't forget to hit that subscribe button." Part da Surtua echoes from the underground. The night air in Cedar Ridge carried the scent of pine and coal dust as Maggie O'Brien led Bridget Murphy through the boarding house basement to a section of stone wall that appeared identical to every other part of the foundation. But appearances, as Maggie had learned from her father, were often the most dangerous deceptions of all. Her weathered fingers found a series of seemingly random stones, and pressed them in a sequence that had been memorized by 3 generations of Caldwell women. The wall swung inward on silent hinges, revealing not the solid earth that logic suggested should lie behind it, but the entrance to a tunnel that disappeared into darkness beyond the reach of their oil lamps. Cool air flowed from the passage, carrying with it the faint sound of running water and the subtle echoes that spoke of vast spaces carved from living rock. "Sweet Mary and Joseph," Bridget whispered, crossing herself as she stared into the hidden passage. "Maggie, how long has this been here?" Maggie lifted her lamp to illuminate the carefully carved stonework that lined the tunnel entrance, her father's craftsmanship still evident after 15 years. "Da started digging the day we bought this property. Said he'd learned in the old country that the only way to be truly safe was to always have a way out that your enemies couldn't see or block." As they stepped into the tunnel, Bridget's eyes widened at the scope of the engineering that surrounded them. This wasn't a crude mine shaft or hastily dug escape route. It was a carefully planned and executed piece of underground architecture that would have impressed engineers from Dublin to Denver. The walls were lined with fitted stone. The floor was level and well drained, and support beams showed evidence of calculations that took into account the specific geological characteristics of Colorado granite. "But Maggie," Bridget said as they walked deeper into the passage, "this must have taken years to complete. How did he manage it without anyone noticing?" Maggie's laugh echoed strangely in the confined space. "Da was a tunnel engineer in Ireland before the famine drove us out. He knew how to move earth quietly and how to disguise construction work as routine maintenance. Every night for 5 years, he came down here and carved out a little more of our insurance policy." The tunnel stretched for nearly a quarter mile, connecting the boarding house to a concealed exit in the foothills behind Cedar Ridge. But its most impressive features were the side passages that branched off at regular intervals, creating a network that extended beneath most of the town's buildings and connected to natural caves that had been carved by underground streams over millions of years. This is how he knew so much about what was happening in town. Maggie continued as they explored a branch that led beneath the general store. Duck could move anywhere in Cedar Ridge without being seen, hear conversations that people thought were private, observe meetings that were supposed to be secret. Bridget paused at an intersection where 4 tunnels met, studying the carved symbols that marked each passage. These markings, they're not English. "Irish Gaelic," Maggie confirmed. They wanted to make sure that even if someone discovered the tunnels, they wouldn't be able to navigate them without understanding the old language. Each symbol tells you where the passage leads and what kind of terrain you'll find when you emerge. As they continued their underground journey, Maggie began to reveal the full scope of her father's paranoid preparations. Hidden chambers contained supplies that could sustain a dozen people for months. Carefully concealed listening posts allowed for surveillance of crucial locations throughout Cedar Ridge. Most importantly, the tunnel system connected to the old mine workings that extended deep into the mountains, creating escape routes that could take fugitives hundreds of miles away from pursuit. "But Maggie," Bridget said as the implications began to dawn on her, "if your father built all this, he must have expected that someday you'd need to use it for something more than just hiding from creditors or avoiding unwanted visitors." Maggie's expression grew somber as she led her friend to a chamber that served as her father's underground office. Maps covered every wall, showing not just the tunnel system, but the geological features of the entire valley. Notebooks contained detailed observations about the coal deposits that lay beneath Cedar Ridge, including information that the Rocky Mountain Coal Company had spent thousands of dollars to acquire through professional surveys. "I knew that someday the coal companies would come," Maggie said, opening a leather-bound journal that contained her father's careful handwriting. He spent 10 years studying the mountain, learning where the coal seams ran and how they connected to the underground water systems that fed the entire valley. Bridget studied the maps with growing understanding of their strategic significance. These tunnels don't just provide hiding places and escape routes. They give you access to the very foundations of the coal company's operations. "Exactly," Maggie confirmed. "Every mine shaft they dig, every processing facility they build, every transportation route they establish, all of it sits on top of a network that we control completely. They think they're dealing with surface rights and mineral claims, but they have no idea what lies beneath their feet." The true genius of Patrick Caldwell's planning became clear as Maggie revealed the extent of his preparations. The tunnel system wasn't just a defensive measure, it was a comprehensive intelligence network that could be used to gather information, disrupt operations, and strike at enemies from unexpected directions. Years of careful observation had given him detailed knowledge of the valley's geology, hydrology, and natural weak points that could be exploited by someone with the right expertise. "But Maggie," Bridget said with growing excitement, "if you know all this, why haven't you used it against the coal company before? You could have prevented them from gaining any foothold in the valley at all." Maggie's expression grew sad as she touched a photograph of her late husband that sat on her father's desk. "Because Seamus made me promise that I'd only use Dawes' knowledge if there was no other choice. He said that once you start a war underground, it becomes something that consumes everything and everyone you care about. He wanted me to try to live in peace first." The memory of her husband's voice echoed in the underground chamber as Maggie recalled their final conversation before the cave-in that claimed his life. Seamus O'Brien had been a gentleman who believed in negotiation and compromise, but he had also been a realist who understood that some enemies could only be stopped through superior force applied at exactly the right moment. "But now," Bridget prompted, "now they've made it clear that peace isn't an option," Maggie replied with grim determination. "Blackthorne and his company won't be satisfied with just my property. They want to control the entire valley, and they'll destroy anyone who stands in their way. Sometimes, Bridget, the only way to preserve what you love is to fight for it with everything you have." As they prepared to return to the surface, Maggie revealed one final aspect of her father's planning that would prove crucial in the coming conflict. Hidden throughout the tunnel system were caches of supplies that went far beyond simple survival needs. Explosives that Patrick Caldwell had acquired during his years as a mining engineer. Communication equipment that could coordinate activities across the entire valley. Most importantly, detailed plans for operations that could cripple the coal company's infrastructure without harming innocent workers or families. "Tomorrow," Maggie said, as they emerged into the basement of the boarding house, "Blackthorne will expect me to either surrender or make futile gestures of legal resistance. What he'll get instead is a lesson in what happens when you threaten someone who knows how to turn the earth itself into a weapon." Bridget's eyes reflected both admiration and concern for her friend's resolve. "Maggie, what you're planning, it's war. Once you start this fight, there'll be no going back to the quiet life you've tried to build." Maggie nodded, understanding the full implications of the choice she was making. "I know. But sometimes war is the only way to preserve the things that make peace worth having. The coal company thinks they can steal from us because we're just poor Irish immigrants with no power to fight back. Tomorrow, they'll learn that some of us carry weapons they never imagined. As dawn broke over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, painting the peaks in shades of gold and rose, Maggie O'Brien stood at her kitchen window, preparing breakfast for the boarding house guests, who had no idea that their landlady was about to transform Cedar Ridge into a battlefield. The corporate men who had threatened her property and her livelihood were sleeping peacefully in their hotel rooms, confident that money and legal manipulation would be sufficient to overwhelm any resistance she might offer. They were about to discover that some widows had fathers who planned for war, and some secrets were more dangerous than any amount of corporate power or territorial influence. The echoes from the underground were about to become a roar that would shake the very foundations of the Rocky Mountain Coal Company's ambitions in Colorado territory. The morning sun cast long shadows across Cedar Ridge as Edmund Blackthorne emerged from the Grand Hotel. His expensive suit, pristine, despite a restless night spent planning the final destruction of Margaret O'Brien's resistance to corporate progress. The coal company executive had built his reputation on the systematic elimination of obstacles to profitable mining operations. And one stubborn Irish widow was not going to derail years of careful planning and investment. Blackthorne was accompanied by his usual entourage, but today the group included additional muscle in the form of 6 professional enforcers who had arrived on the overnight train from Denver. These were not local toughs or territorial ruffians. They were industrial specialists who had broken strikes in Pennsylvania coal fields and eliminated troublesome property owners throughout the mining regions of the West. Their leader was a man named Samuel Cross, whose scarred face and cold eyes marked him as someone who had learned his trade in the killing fields of the Civil War before discovering that civilian violence could be even more profitable than military service. Cross carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never failed to complete an assignment, regardless of the methods required. Mrs. O'Brien's resistance ends today, Blackthorne announced to his team as they prepared to make their final approach to the boarding house. If she won't accept our generous offer voluntarily, we'll simply have to demonstrate that continued defiance is not in her best interests. But as the corporate delegation walked through the streets of Cedar Ridge, they began to notice signs that something had changed during the night. Miners, who should have been preparing for their shifts, stood in small groups, speaking in low voices and casting hostile glances at the company men. Women who had previously averted their eyes now watched the proceedings with the intense attention of people who sensed that something significant was about to happen. Most disturbing of all was the absence of the usual sounds of mining activity. The stamp mills that should have been processing ore were silent. The conveyor systems that carried coal from the mountain were motionless, and the whistle that summoned workers to their shifts had not blown at its customary time. "Mr. Blackthorne," Cross said quietly, his professional instincts warning him that the tactical situation had somehow shifted overnight. "Something's not right here. It's too quiet. And the locals are acting like they know something we don't." Blackthorne dismissed his enforcers' concerns with the arrogance of someone who believed that superior resources guaranteed victory. "Cross, you're being paranoid. These are simple mining families who depend on company wages for survival. They're not going to risk their livelihoods to support one woman's futile gesture of defiance." But as they approached the boarding house, Blackthorne began to understand that his assessment of the situation had been fundamentally wrong. Margaret O'Brien stood on her porch as she had the previous evening, but her bearing had changed from defensive resignation to something that reminded Cross uncomfortably of officers he had served under during the war, commanders who radiated confidence because they held tactical advantages that their enemies couldn't see or understand. "Mr. Blackthorne," Maggie said with a smile that held no warmth whatsoever. "I trust you slept well. I'm afraid your morning might be somewhat more eventful than you anticipated." Before Blackthorne could respond to her cryptic greeting, the ground beneath Cedar Ridge began to tremble with a low, rhythmic rumbling that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself. The vibration was subtle at first, barely noticeable except to those who knew what to listen for. But it quickly intensified until everyone in the street could feel it through the soles of their boots. "What the hell for?" Cross began, his hand moving instinctively toward his weapon. The rumbling was followed by a series of sharp cracks that echoed across the valley like gunshots, but louder and more sustained than any firearm could produce. Then, with a roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the mountains, the main access road to the Rocky Mountain Coal Company's processing facility simply disappeared into a perfectly circular hole that appeared to drop into the center of the earth. "Sweet Jesus," one of Cross's men whispered, staring at the collapse that had just cut off the company's primary transportation route. But the destruction was only beginning. As Blackthorne and his men watched in horrified fascination, sections of railroad track began buckling and sinking as the ground beneath them gave way to carefully planned excavations. Water from underground streams poured into the newly created voids, creating a network of obstacles that would take months to repair and millions of dollars to overcome. "Mrs. O'Brien," Blackthorne said with dawning understanding of the scope of what he was witnessing. "What have you done?" Maggie's smile widened as she gestured toward the systematic destruction of the coal company's infrastructure. "Mr. Blackthorne, I mentioned yesterday that my family has experience dealing with powerful oppressors. What I didn't mention is that my father was one of the finest tunnel engineers in Ireland before circumstances forced him to seek his fortune in America." The implications hit Blackthorne like a physical blow. If Margaret O'Brien had access to professional engineering knowledge and years of preparation time, she could have undermined every aspect of the company's operations without anyone realizing what was happening. The trembling ground and collapsing infrastructure weren't natural disasters. They were the result of the most sophisticated sabotage operation he had ever encountered. "This is impossible," Blackthorne protested. "No one person could have orchestrated something like this. You'd need teams of engineers, months of preparation, detailed knowledge of our entire operation." "All of which," Maggie interrupted cheerfully, "my father provided through 15 years of careful observation and planning. You see, Mr. Blackthorne, when you threaten an Irish family, you're not just challenging one person, you're taking on generations of accumulated knowledge about survival in the face of impossible odds." Cross stepped forward, his professional assessment of the situation leading him to conclusions that his employer was still struggling to accept. "Ma'am, what you've done here, this level of coordination and timing, it's military-quality work. Where did you learn this kind of tactical planning?" Maggie's expression grew solemn as she remembered the stories her father had told about the old country, about English landlords who tried to drive Irish families from their homes and discovered that some people knew how to fight back in ways that couldn't be stopped by conventional military force. "Mr. Cross, my people have been resisting oppression for centuries. Sometimes that resistance takes the form of political action or legal challenges. But sometimes, when those methods fail, it becomes necessary to demonstrate that the Earth itself can be an ally to those who know how to ask for its help. As if to emphasize her point, another section of the coal company's infrastructure collapsed into a sinkhole that appeared to connect with underground watercourses. The damage was so precisely targeted and comprehensive that it was clear this wasn't random destruction, but the implementation of a carefully designed plan that had taken into account every aspect of the company's operations. "Mrs. O'Brien," Blackthorne said with forced calm, "I think you may be underestimating the resources that the Rocky Mountain Coal Company can bring to bear in response to this setback. We have political connections that extend to the territorial government and beyond. We can have federal marshals here within days, territorial militia within hours." Maggie nodded as if she had expected exactly this threat. "Mr. Blackthorne, I'm sure you do have powerful friends who've profited from your company's operations, but I wonder how loyal they'll remain when they discover that your setback is going to cost them millions of dollars and expose business practices that might not survive close scrutiny by honest federal investigators." The widow's confidence was unnerving, suggesting resources and preparations that went far beyond what a simple boarding house operator should have been able to arrange. Cross found himself studying the surrounding terrain with professional interest, noting features that he had dismissed as natural formations, but which might actually be carefully disguised engineering works. "Ma'am," Cross said carefully, "you seem to be implying that this morning's events are just the beginning of your resistance. Exactly how extensive are the preparations you've made?" Maggie's answer came not in words, but in action. She raised her hand in a gesture that seemed casual, but was actually a carefully planned signal. Throughout Cedar Ridge, similar gestures were repeated by people who had been watching from windows and doorways, creating a communication network that Cross recognized with growing alarm. Within minutes, the systematic destruction of the coal company's infrastructure expanded from the transportation routes to include processing facilities, administrative buildings, and even the company store where workers purchased supplies at inflated prices. But the demolition was surgically precise, targeting only corporate assets while leaving homes, churches, and community buildings completely untouched. "This is a coordinated military operation," Cross reported to Blackthorne with professional respect for whoever had planned it. "Ma'am, this level of organization and execution, it's impressive, but you have to know that the company will respond with overwhelming force. They'll bring in federal troops if necessary." Maggie's laugh carried echoes of her father's voice and generations of Irish defiance against impossible odds. "Mr. Cross, let me show you something that might help you understand the true nature of the situation you're facing." She led the corporate delegation to a vantage point that overlooked the entire valley. Where the scope of the morning's destruction became fully apparent, every major piece of coal company infrastructure had been systematically disabled or destroyed. But the damage formed a pattern that revealed an underlying intelligence that Cross found deeply unsettling. "The tunnels my father dug don't just run beneath Cedar Ridge," Maggie explained, as Cross studied the pattern of destruction with growing understanding. "They connect to natural cave systems that extend for hundreds of miles through these mountains. Every mine shaft your company has dug, every processing facility you've built, every transportation route you've established, all of it sits on top of a network that we've controlled since before you even knew this valley existed." The revelation hit both Blackthorne and Cross with the force of an avalanche. If the O'Brien family had access to a comprehensive underground network that predated the coal company's operations, they could strike at will against any target while remaining completely immune to conventional retaliation. More importantly, they could sustain their resistance indefinitely while the company bled money and resources trying to repair damage that could be recreated faster than it could be fixed. "Mrs. O'Brien," Blackthorne said with the first genuine respect he had shown since arriving in Cedar Ridge, "what exactly do you want from the Rocky Mountain Coal Company, sir?" Maggie's smile held the satisfaction of someone who had finally been asked the right question. "Mr. Blackthorne, I want you to pack up your operation and leave this valley. Take your enforcers, your corrupt lawyers, your fraudulent mineral rights, and your corporate arrogance, and find somewhere else to practice your particular brand of legalized theft." The demand was simple, direct, and completely unacceptable to a man who had built his career on never surrendering to local resistance. But as Blackthorne looked out over the systematically destroyed remains of his company's investment in Cedar Ridge, he began to understand that he was facing an opponent who held advantages he couldn't match and couldn't counter. The engineer's daughter had just demonstrated that some knowledge was more powerful than money, some preparation was more valuable than connections, and some resistance was impossible to break because it was built on foundations that went deeper than any corporate ambition. The question now was whether Edmund Blackthorne was wise enough to recognize defeat when it stared him in the face, or whether his pride would drive him to escalate a conflict that he had already lost before he understood it had begun. Amazing stuff. Folks, did you see that coordination? Maggie's father didn't just dig escape tunnels. He created an entire underground warfare network that's been lying dormant for 15 years. The way she just systematically dismantled the coal company's entire operation in one morning is absolutely brilliant tactical thinking. What do you think Blackthorne's going to do now that he realizes he's not facing a helpless widow, but a master strategist? Let me know in the comments, and if this story has you completely hooked, hit that subscribe button. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the destruction that had transformed Cedar Ridge from a thriving coal mining operation into a battlefield where conventional military tactics meant nothing and underground engineering determined victory or defeat. Edmund Blackthorne stood among the ruins of his company's infrastructure, his expensive suit dusty, and his confidence shattered by the scope of what one Irish widow had accomplished in a single morning. Samuel Cross moved through the debris with professional interest, his trained eye cataloging the precision of the demolition work that had crippled the Rocky Mountain Coal Company's operations. This wasn't random sabotage or the desperate lashing out of a cornered victim. It was military engineering executed by someone who understood both the strengths and weaknesses of underground construction. "Mr. Blackthorne," Cross reported as he completed his tactical assessment, "whoever planned this operation has detailed knowledge of our entire infrastructure. They knew exactly where to strike for maximum damage with minimum effort. More importantly, they've positioned themselves so that conventional retaliation is impossible." Blackthorne wiped sweat from his forehead as he contemplated the financial disaster that Margaret O'Brien had created in less than 6 hours. The destroyed transportation routes alone would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to repair, and that assumed they could be repaired at all, given the geological instability that the morning's collapses had revealed. "Cross," Blackthorne said with the desperation of someone whose career was collapsing along with his company's assets. "What would it take to root them out of those tunnels? We have resources, connections, professional soldiers. Surely we can mount some kind of effective response." Cross shook his head grimly. his experience in irregular warfare during the Civil War giving him a clear understanding of the tactical situation they faced. "Sir, whoever built that tunnel system designed it specifically to resist exactly the kind of assault you're suggesting. Underground fighting favors defenders who know the terrain, and these people have had 15 years to prepare for this kind of conflict." As if to emphasize Cross's point, the ground beneath their feet trembled again, not with the violence of explosive demolition, but with the subtle vibration that suggested machinery operating in hidden spaces beneath the earth. The sound was followed by the appearance of new sinkholes that swallowed additional sections of the coal company's remaining infrastructure. "They're still active," Cross observed with grudging professional admiration. "Ma'am has people working underground right now, probably expanding the damage while we stand here trying to figure out how to respond." The realization that their enemies were not just hidden, but actively continuing their assault, sent a chill through Blackthorn's remaining courage. Margaret O'Brien wasn't just defending her property. She was systematically destroying every trace of the coal company's presence in the valley, while remaining completely immune to retaliation. "Mr. Blackthorn," came a voice from behind them, carrying the musical accent of County Cork and the confidence of someone who held every advantage in a deadly game. "I see you've had time to inspect the morning's work. I trust you're beginning to understand the true nature of your situation." Maggie O'Brien approached through the ruins with the calm assurance of a general surveying a successful battlefield. She was accompanied by Tom Murphy, Bridget's husband and the unofficial leader of Cedar Ridge's Irish community, whose presence suggested that the morning's operation had involved far more people than Blackthorn had initially realized. "Mrs. O'Brien," Blackthorn said with forced civility, "I'll admit that your sabotage operation has been more comprehensive than I anticipated. But surely you understand that the Rocky Mountain Coal Company has resources that extend far beyond this valley. We can rebuild, bring in federal support, escalate this conflict to levels that will destroy everything you claim to be protecting." Maggie's smile held the kind of patient wisdom that came from generations of Irish resistance to overwhelming odds. "Mr. Blackthorn, I think you're still misunderstanding the nature of what you're facing. This morning's demonstration wasn't the extent of our capabilities. It was merely a gentle suggestion that you reconsider your position." Tom Murphy stepped forward, his weathered face bearing the scars of 30 years in the mines and the determination of someone who had finally found a way to fight back against corporate exploitation. "Blackthorn, what you saw this morning was planned by one man working alone in his spare time. What you're about to face is an entire community that spent 3 years learning from Maggie's father and preparing for the day when we'd have to defend our homes." The implications of Murphy's statement sent another chill through Cross's professional assessment of their situation. If the morning's destruction had been accomplished by a single engineer working alone, what could an entire community of trained miners accomplish when they turned their underground expertise toward military objectives? "You're talking about terrorism," Blackthorn accused, though his voice lacked conviction. "I'm talking about self-defense," Maggie corrected firmly. "Mr. Blackthorn, your company came to our valley with fraudulent legal claims and threats of violence against families who have lived here for decades. When we tried to resolve this dispute through proper legal channels, you responded with intimidation and corporate corruption. Now you're discovering what happens when you push Irish families beyond the limits of their patience." As if summoned by her words, groups of miners began emerging from concealed positions throughout the valley, their movements coordinated by signals that Cross couldn't identify, but clearly represented a sophisticated communication system. These weren't random workers responding to immediate threats. They were organized resistance fighters implementing a carefully planned military operation. "How many people are involved in this?" Cross asked, his professional curiosity overcoming his employer's political concerns. "Every Irish family in the valley," Tom Murphy replied with pride. "Every man who's lost friends to unsafe mines. Every woman who's buried a husband killed by company negligence. Every child who's watched their parents struggle against corporate greed that treats human beings like disposable machinery." The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Blackthorne had assumed he was dealing with isolated resistance from a single property owner, but instead he was facing a coordinated uprising by an entire ethnic community that had been planning for this confrontation for years. "Mrs. O'Brien," Blackthorne said with growing desperation, "what you're describing is a civil war. The territorial government won't tolerate armed rebellion against legitimate business operations. Federal troops will be brought in to restore order." Maggie's laugh echoed strangely in the mountain air, carrying undertones that reminded Cross of sounds he had heard in the tunnels beneath Confederate fortifications during the siege of Petersburg. "Mr. Blackthorne, let me show you something that might help you understand why federal intervention won't be as effective as you seem to believe." She led the corporate delegation to the edge of town, where a seemingly natural rock formation revealed itself under closer inspection to be a carefully camouflaged entrance to the underground network. The opening was large enough for several people to pass through simultaneously, but more importantly, it was positioned so that anyone attempting to assault it would be exposed to defensive fire from multiple concealed positions. "My father didn't just dig escape tunnels," Maggie explained as Cross studied the defensive preparations with growing alarm. "He created a complete underground military installation that can house and supply the entire population of Cedar Ridge for months if necessary. We have food, water, weapons, medical supplies, and communication equipment that connects us to Irish communities throughout Colorado Territory." The revelation hit Blackthorne like a physical blow. If the O'Brien family had spent 15 years preparing for siege warfare, they could sustain their resistance indefinitely while the coal company bled money and resources trying to maintain operations in a hostile environment. But more importantly, Tom Murphy added with grim satisfaction, "We have knowledge that your company desperately needs and can't obtain anywhere else. You want to extract coal from this valley. You'll need our cooperation, because we're the only ones who understand the underground geology well enough to work safely in these mountains." Cross nodded slowly as he grasped the full implications of what he was hearing. They're not just resisting extraction, they're making extraction impossible without their participation. Brilliant. "Exactly," Maggie confirmed. "Mr. Blackthorne, every tunnel your company digs, every shaft you sink, every support beam you install, all of it depends on geological knowledge that only we possess. Try to work without us, and you'll face cave-ins, floods, gas explosions, and every other hazard that makes underground mining the most dangerous occupation in America." The strategic genius of the O'Brien family's planning was becoming clear to Cross, even if his employer was still struggling to accept it. They hadn't just prepared to resist the coal company, they had positioned themselves as indispensable partners whose cooperation was essential for any successful mining operation in the valley. "This is blackmail," Blackthorne protested. "This is negotiation," Maggie corrected. "Mr. Blackthorne, my father spent 15 years studying every aspect of this valley's geology. He mapped underground water systems, identified unstable rock formations, tracked gas deposits that could explode without warning, and documented fault lines that could collapse entire mining operations. That knowledge is our inheritance, and we're prepared to use it to protect our community. As the afternoon wore on and additional damage continued to appear throughout the valley, Blackthorn began to understand that he was facing an opponent who had turned the very foundations of successful mining into weapons against corporate exploitation. The O'Brien family wasn't just threatening to destroy existing infrastructure. They were making it impossible for the coal company to operate safely in the valley without their active cooperation. "What exactly are you proposing?" Blackthorn asked finally, his voice carrying the resignation of someone who was beginning to understand that conventional business practices would not be sufficient to resolve this conflict. Maggie exchanged glances with Tom Murphy before answering, her expression reflecting the careful consideration of someone who had been planning this moment for years. "Mr. Blackthorn, we're proposing a partnership based on mutual respect and shared benefits. The coal company can extract resources from our valley, but only under conditions that protect worker safety, preserve community stability, and provide fair compensation to the families whose labor creates your profits." The terms were revolutionary by the standards of 1870s industrial relations, but Cross could see that they were also the only viable option given the tactical realities of the situation. The O'Brien family had created conditions where cooperation was more profitable than conquest, and resistance was more sustainable than submission. "And if we refuse?" Blackthorn asked, though he already knew the answer. Tom Murphy's smile was as cold as mountain snow in January. "Then you'll discover just how extensive our preparations really are. What you've seen today was a demonstration. Blackthorn, push us further, and you'll face the full capabilities of a community that's been preparing for this fight since before your company knew this valley existed." As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold, Edmund Blackthorn found himself facing a choice that would define not just his own career, but the future of industrial relations throughout the Colorado Territory. He could escalate the conflict and discover just how devastating the O'Brien family's underground war could become. Or he could swallow his corporate pride and negotiate with people who had proven they could make his company's operations impossible without their cooperation. The underground war had already begun, and Maggie O'Brien held every advantage that mattered in a conflict where knowledge of the earth itself determined victory or defeat. The question now was whether Blackthorn was wise enough to recognize when he had been outmaneuvered by a master strategist, or whether his arrogance would drive him to escalate a fight that he had already lost. The evening mist rolled down from the Sangre de Cristo Mountains like the breath of ancient gods, shrouding Cedar Ridge in a ghostly veil that seemed to muffle sound and conceal movements that ordinary eyes could not detect. Edmund Blackthorn stood in the ruins of his company's local headquarters, surrounded by telegrams from Denver that made his blood run cold with their implications for his career and the Rocky Mountain Coal Company's future. The first telegram was from the company's board of directors, demanding immediate explanations for the catastrophic failure of security protocols that had resulted in millions of dollars in damaged infrastructure. The second was from territorial authorities, warning that federal investigators were en route to determine whether the coal company's mineral rights claims were legally valid. Most disturbing of all was a message from investors in New York, threatening to withdraw financial backing unless the situation in Cedar Ridge was resolved within 48 hours. "Mr. Blackthorn, Samuel Cross reported as he returned from a reconnaissance mission that had taken him to the edges of the O'Brien tunnel system. I've completed my assessment of their defensive capabilities. Sir, we're not dealing with amateur resistance fighters. This is a military-grade installation that would be difficult to assault, even with federal troops and artillery support. Blackthorn crumpled the latest telegram in his fist, his face reflecting the desperation of someone whose carefully constructed career was collapsing faster than the coal company's mining infrastructure. Cross, there has to be a way to break them. No ragtag group of Irish miners can stand against the resources we can bring to bear. But even as he spoke the words, Blackthorn knew they were false bravado. The O'Brien family's resistance was not the desperate lashing out of cornered victims. It was the calculated implementation of a strategy that had been 15 years in the making. Every move they had made suggested access to resources and knowledge that transcended anything a simple boarding house operator should have been able to arrange. Sir, Cross said carefully, I think you need to understand that we're not dealing with ordinary resistance fighters. The woman you've been dismissing as a simple Irish widow, she's demonstrated tactical capabilities that would impress generals from both sides of the Civil War. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the damaged building. But instead of the heavy boots of working miners or the measured tread of Maggie O'Brien's confident approach, these steps carried the rhythm of someone accustomed to military precision and formal protocol. A figure emerged from the evening mist, wearing the uniform of a United States Army colonel, his bearing erect despite obvious travel fatigue, and his eyes holding the sharp intelligence of someone who had spent years dealing with complex political and military situations. Behind him walked two men in civilian clothes, whose careful movements and watchful expressions marked them as federal investigators. Mr. Blackthorn, the colonel said with crisp military courtesy. I'm Colonel William Hayes, sent by the War Department to investigate reports of civil unrest in this district. These gentlemen are Federal Marshals Patterson and Webb, here to examine certain irregularities in mineral rights documentation. The arrival of federal authority sent a surge of hope through Blackthorn's desperate calculations. If he could convince the military that Margaret O'Brien's resistance constituted armed rebellion against legitimate government authority, federal troops could be brought in to crush the underground network that had made his position untenable. Colonel Hayes, Blackthorn said with relief evident in his voice. Thank God you're here. We're dealing with a coordinated terrorist attack against legitimate mining operations. Irish separatists have destroyed millions of dollars in infrastructure and threaten continued violence against anyone who opposes their illegal occupation of territorial land. Colonel Hayes studied the destruction that surrounded them with professional interest, noting details that suggested his understanding of military engineering was far more sophisticated than Blackthorn had assumed. Mr. Blackthorn, I've reviewed the territorial records regarding mineral rights in this valley. I'm afraid there are some discrepancies that require clarification before any federal intervention can be authorized. The statement sent a chill through Blackthorn's remaining confidence. If federal investigators were questioning the legal basis of the coal company's claims, his entire position in Cedar Ridge might be built on foundations as unstable as the geological structures that the O'Brien family had been exploiting. What kind of discrepancies? Cross asked, his professional instincts warning him that the situation was becoming even more complex than they had realized. Marshal Patterson opened a leather portfolio and withdrew documents that Blackthorn recognized with growing alarm. Mr. Blackthorn, these are the original territorial surveys that established mineral rights in this valley. According to our research, the Rocky Mountain Coal Company's claims are based on documentation that appears to have been altered after the fact. The implications hit Blackthorn like an avalanche. If the federal government had discovered evidence of fraudulent mineral rights claims, his company could face criminal prosecution, in addition to the financial disaster that was already unfolding in Cedar Ridge. "That's impossible," Blackthorn protested, though his voice lacked conviction. "Our legal department verified all documentation before we began operations here." "Mr. Blackthorn," Marshal Webb said with the patient tone of someone delivering bad news, "we've been investigating irregular mineral rights claims throughout Colorado Territory for the past 6 months. Your company's documentation shows signs of the same alterations we've found in other cases that are currently under federal prosecution." As the federal officials continued their examination of the coal company's legal position, the sound of approaching voices drew their attention to a group emerging from the concealed entrance to the O'Brien tunnel system. Margaret O'Brien led the delegation, but she was accompanied by people whose presence transformed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. The first was an elderly man whose bearing and dress marked him as someone of considerable education and authority. He moved with the careful dignity of advanced age, but his eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone whose mental faculties remained undiminished by time. Behind him walked Tom Murphy and several other Irish miners. But these men now carried themselves with the confidence of people who knew they held legal as well as tactical advantages. "Colonel Hayes," Maggie said with respectful courtesy, "welcome to Cedar Ridge. I believe you've been looking for evidence regarding mineral rights irregularities in this valley. Perhaps we can provide some information that will clarify the situation." The elderly man stepped forward with a slight bow that spoke of old-world education and formal training. "Colonel, my name is Professor Patrick Caldwell, formerly of Trinity College, Dublin, more recently a consulting engineer for the United States Geological Survey. I believe my expertise may be relevant to your investigation." Blackthorn's face went pale as he recognized the name from geological reports he had reviewed during the company's initial assessment of Cedar Ridge. Patrick Caldwell was one of the most respected mining engineers in America, whose surveys and recommendations had guided territorial development policy for the past 2 decades. "Professor Caldwell," Colonel Hayes said with obvious respect, "I'm familiar with your work. Your geological surveys have been invaluable to federal land management throughout the Western Territories." Caldwell smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had spent years preparing for this moment. "Colonel, I've spent the past 15 years conducting an unauthorized but comprehensive geological survey of this valley. I believe my findings will be of considerable interest to your investigation of mineral rights claims." As the professor began presenting documentation that revealed the true geological characteristics of the Cedar Ridge Valley, Blackthorn realized that he was facing something far more dangerous than Irish resistance fighters or federal investigators. The O'Brien family's secret weapon was not underground tunnels or community solidarity. It was access to scientific knowledge that could invalidate every legal claim the coal company had made. "Professor," Marshal Patterson said as he examined the geological surveys, "these findings suggest that the coal deposits in this valley are far more complex than previous surveys indicated. Are you saying that extraction would be impossible without detailed knowledge of underground water systems and structural weaknesses?" "Exactly," Caldwell confirmed. "Gentlemen, any mining operation in this valley that doesn't take into account the specific geological characteristics I've documented will face catastrophic failures that could kill hundreds of workers and destroy millions of dollars in equipment." The revelation transformed the entire framework of the conflict. The O'Brien family wasn't just resisting coal extraction, they were the only people who possessed the knowledge necessary to make extraction safe and profitable. Their underground network wasn't just a military installation, it was a research facility that had been gathering scientific data essential to any successful mining operation. "Mrs. O'Brien," Colonel Hayes said with new understanding of the situation he was investigating. "I believe you mentioned that your family might be willing to cooperate with legitimate mining operations under appropriate conditions. What exactly would those conditions entail?" Maggie's answer would determine not just the future of the Rocky Mountain Coal Company, but the entire framework of industrial development in the Colorado Territory. As she prepared to speak, the evening mist seemed to hold its breath, waiting for words that would echo through the mountains for generations to come. The heart of the mountain was about to reveal its secrets, and those secrets would reshape everything that powerful men thought they knew about the relationship between corporate ambition and the knowledge that came from generations of careful observation and respect for the earth itself. This is getting absolutely incredible. Folks, Professor Caldwell's revelation just changed everything. Maggie's family wasn't just hiding in tunnels. They were conducting a 15-year geological survey that makes them indispensable to any mining operation. And now we've got federal investigators questioning the coal company's legal claims. The plot is thickening faster than mountain fog. What do you think Maggie's conditions are going to be? Drop your predictions in the comments. And if you're as riveted as I am, hit that subscribe button. The dawn light filtering through the morning mist cast an ethereal glow over Cedar Ridge as Margaret O'Brien stood before an assembly that would have been unimaginable just 3 days earlier. Federal officers, territorial officials, coal company executives, and Irish miners gathered in the town's small church, the only building large enough to accommodate everyone who had a stake in the negotiations that would determine the future of the entire valley. Professor Patrick Caldwell sat at a table covered with geological surveys, mineral samples, and engineering documents that represented 15 years of meticulous scientific research. Beside him, Colonel Hayes studied reports that had arrived during the night from federal investigators in Denver, while Marshals Patterson and Webb examined evidence that would reshape territorial mineral rights law throughout the Colorado Territory. Edmund Blackthorne occupied a chair near the back of the church, his expensive suit wrinkled and his confidence completely shattered by the revelation that his company's entire legal position was built on fraudulent documentation. Samuel Cross stood behind him, no longer a corporate enforcer, but a professional observer studying a masterclass in strategic planning and tactical execution. "Ladies and gentlemen," Colonel Hayes began with military formality, "we're here to resolve a dispute that has implications far beyond this valley. The evidence presented by Professor Caldwell demonstrates that previous geological surveys of this region were incomplete and potentially dangerous. More importantly, federal marshal investigation has revealed systematic fraud in mineral rights documentation throughout Colorado Territory." Maggie rose from her seat in the front pew, her bearing reflecting the confidence of someone who had spent years preparing for this moment. She wore a simple dark dress that emphasized her dignity rather than her femininity, and her voice carried clearly to every corner of the church as she began to speak. "Colonel Hayes, Marshal Patterson, distinguished guests," she said with the formal courtesy that her father had taught her during their years of careful preparation. "My family has never sought conflict with legitimate business interests or lawful government authority. What we have opposed, and will continue to oppose, is the systematic theft of our community's resources through corruption, fraud, and violence. Professor Caldwell stood and moved to a large map that showed the geological structure of the entire valley. Colonel, the mineral rights claims that brought the Rocky Mountain Coal Company to Cedar Ridge are based on surveys that ignored crucial geological features. Any extraction operation based on those flawed surveys would result in catastrophic failures that could kill miners and destroy equipment worth millions of dollars. Marshal Patterson consulted his notes before addressing the assembly. Professor Caldwell's findings are supported by federal investigation into the Rocky Mountain Coal Company's documentation. We have evidence that territorial surveys were altered to misrepresent both the extent and the accessibility of coal deposits throughout this region. The revelation sent a murmur through the assembled crowd, but Blackthorne remained silent, recognizing that any protest would only dig his grave deeper. His company's entire Colorado operation was built on fraudulent claims that would not survive federal scrutiny, and his career was effectively over, regardless of what happened in Cedar Ridge. "Mrs. O'Brien," Colonel Hayes said, "your family's resistance to coal company operations appears to have been justified by both legal and safety considerations. However, the federal government remains interested in legitimate resource extraction that could benefit territorial development. What terms would your community consider acceptable for future mining operations?" Maggie had spent 3 sleepless nights preparing for this question, balancing her desire for justice against her recognition that the valley's future depended on finding a sustainable relationship with the forces of industrial development. Her answer would determine whether Cedar Ridge became a model for ethical resource extraction or a cautionary tale about the cost of corporate greed. "Colonel Hayes," she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who spoke for an entire community. "My family is prepared to share our geological knowledge and provide technical assistance for mining operations that meet specific conditions designed to protect both worker safety and community welfare." Tom Murphy stepped forward to stand beside Maggie, his presence representing the miners who had risked everything to support her resistance to corporate exploitation. "Colonel, we're not opposed to mining. Most of us have spent our lives underground, and we understand the value of the resources beneath these mountains. What we oppose is mining operations that treat workers as disposable and communities as obstacles to profit." Professor Caldwell moved to a detailed cross-section diagram that showed the relationship between coal deposits and underground water systems. "Gentlemen, safe extraction of coal from this valley requires precise understanding of geological structures that can only be obtained through the kind of long-term observation my family has conducted. Any company that attempts extraction without this knowledge will face disasters that could set back territorial development by decades." The professor's words carried weight that transcended immediate political considerations. If the O'Brien family possessed scientific knowledge essential to safe mining operations, their cooperation became a matter of territorial economic development rather than local property disputes. "What specific conditions are you proposing?" Marshal Webb asked, his legal training focused on the practical details of any agreement that might emerge from these negotiations. Maggie withdrew a document from her coat, not the hastily prepared demands of desperate resistance fighters, but a carefully crafted proposal that reflected years of consideration and consultation with experts in mining law and territorial governance. "First," she said, reading from the document, "any mining operation in this valley must employ local workers under contracts that guarantee fair wages, safe working conditions, and compensation for families of workers killed or injured in company operations." The demand was revolutionary by the standards of 1870s industrial relations, but Colonel Hayes recognized its practical wisdom. Mining operations that maintained worker loyalty were far more productive and secure than those that relied on intimidation and exploitation. Second, Maggie continued, the community of Cedar Ridge must have legal representation on any board that makes decisions affecting local mining operations. Our people understand this land in ways that distant investors cannot, and their expertise is essential to successful long-term extraction. Tom Murphy nodded approvingly at this condition, which would prevent future coal companies from repeating the mistakes that had brought the Rocky Mountain Coal Company to disaster in Cedar Ridge. Third, Maggie said, her voice growing stronger as she approached the heart of her family's demands. Professor Caldwell and his geological surveys must be officially recognized by territorial authorities as the authoritative source of information about mining safety in this region. No extraction operation should be permitted without his certification that it can be conducted without unacceptable risk to workers or the environment. The condition was brilliant in its simplicity and devastating in its implications for corporate autonomy. By establishing her father as the territorial authority on mining safety, Maggie had ensured that future extraction operations would require the O'Brien family's ongoing cooperation and consent. And finally, she concluded, a percentage of mining profits must be dedicated to community development schools, medical facilities, infrastructure improvements, and economic diversification that will sustain Cedar Ridge after the coal deposits are exhausted. The terms were comprehensive, fair, and completely unacceptable to traditional corporate thinking about resource extraction. But they were also the only viable framework for mining operations in a valley where the O'Brien family controlled both the underground access routes and the scientific knowledge necessary for safe extraction. Colonel Hayes studied the proposal with the careful attention of someone who understood its implications for federal policy throughout the Western Territories. Mrs. O'Brien, these terms represent a fundamental change in the relationship between mining companies and local communities. Are you prepared to enforce these conditions if they're violated? Maggie's smile held all the confidence of someone who had just demonstrated her family's capabilities in the most dramatic way possible. Colonel, we've spent 15 years preparing to defend our community against any threat. What you've seen over the past 3 days was a gentle demonstration of our capabilities. Push us further, and you'll discover that some knowledge is more powerful than any amount of corporate money or political influence. Professor Caldwell moved to a final map that showed the full extent of the tunnel network that lay beneath Cedar Ridge and the surrounding mountains. Colonel, my family has created an underground intelligence network that extends throughout Colorado Territory. We know where the coal deposits are, where they're not, and most importantly, how to extract them safely or make extraction impossible, depending on whether mining companies choose cooperation or conquest. The revelation was the final piece of a puzzle that had been 15 years in the making. The O'Brien family hadn't just prepared to resist corporate exploitation, they had positioned themselves as indispensable partners whose knowledge and cooperation were essential to any successful mining operation in the region. As the morning sun climbed higher over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, Edmund Blackthorne finally understood the true scope of what he had attempted to steal and the magnitude of his failure. The Rocky Mountain Coal Company had come to Cedar Ridge expecting to find a helpless Irish widow whose property could be seized through legal manipulation and corporate intimidation. Instead, they had encountered a master strategist whose family had spent a generation preparing for exactly this confrontation, and whose weapons were knowledge, community solidarity, and the kind of long-term planning that made corporate quarterly thinking seem pathetically short-sighted. "Colonel Hayes," Blackthorne said with the resignation of someone accepting defeat. "The Rocky Mountain Coal Company withdraws all claims to mineral rights in Cedar Ridge Valley. We'll be filing for bankruptcy protection and liquidating our Colorado operations within the week." The admission sent a ripple of satisfaction through the Irish miners, who had risked everything to support Maggie's resistance. But the widow herself showed no triumph in victory. Instead, her expression reflected the somber understanding that true victory lay not in destroying enemies, but in building something better from the wreckage of their ambitions. "Mr. Blackthorne," she said with genuine sympathy, "corporate greed destroyed your company, not Irish resistance. My family's offer remains open to any legitimate mining operation that's willing to treat workers and communities as partners rather than obstacles." As the assembly began to disperse and federal officials prepared to return to Denver with evidence that would reshape territorial mining law, Maggie O'Brien stood in the doorway of the church where her community had gathered to witness the end of one era and the beginning of another. The secret tunnels that her father had dug were no longer hidden weapons of resistance. They had become the foundation of a new model for resource extraction that balanced corporate profits with community welfare and scientific knowledge with environmental responsibility. Truth had indeed found its level, like water seeking low ground, and in finding that level, it had created a current that would flow through the mountains of Colorado for generations to come, carrying with it the lesson that some knowledge was more valuable than gold. Some communities were stronger than corporate power, and some widows carried secrets that could reshape the very foundations of industrial civilization. The engineer's daughter had not just defended her father's legacy, she had transformed it into something that would benefit every family who chose honest work over easy exploitation, and every community that valued cooperation over conquest. As the crimson sunset painted the peaks of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains in shades of triumph and promise, Margaret O'Brien walked home through the streets of Cedar Ridge, knowing that her husband Seamus would have been proud of what she had accomplished, and her father Patrick would have been amazed at how far his careful preparations had carried their family's fight for justice. The coal company that had threatened a widow had indeed faced the woman who knew secret tunnels. But more importantly, they had faced a community that refused to be intimidated, a family that planned for generations rather than quarters, and a tradition of resistance that was older than corporate America and would endure long after the last coal seam was exhausted and the mountains reclaimed their eternal peace. The mountains themselves had spoken through Margaret O'Brien's voice, and their message would echo across the frontier wherever powerful men sought to exploit those they deemed powerless, reminding future predators that some secrets were more dangerous than any weapon, and some knowledge was worth fighting for regardless of the cost. Well, my friends, what an absolutely incredible conclusion to this epic tale. Margaret O'Brien didn't just defeat the coal company. She revolutionized the entire relationship between mining corporations and local communities. That proposal she presented wasn't just terms of surrender. It was a blueprint for ethical resource extraction that was decades ahead of its time. The way she transformed her father's secret tunnels from defensive weapons into the foundation of a new economic model shows the kind of strategic brilliance that built the legends of the American frontier. And Professor Caldwell's 15-year geological survey, pure genius turning scientific knowledge into unassailable political power. Where are you watching from today? I'd love to hear your thoughts. on how Margaret balanced justice with practical economics. Did you see that twist coming with the fraudulent mineral rights? Or were you as surprised as Blackthorn when the federal investigators revealed the extent of the coal company's corruption? If you loved this story of Irish determination, underground engineering, and the power of long-term strategic thinking over short-term corporate greed, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. I've got more amazing tales of frontier justice, hidden knowledge, and the indomitable spirit of people who refuse to be conquered. Remember, folks, sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a gun or a legal document, but knowledge passed down through generations, and the wisdom to use that knowledge when justice demands action. Margaret O'Brien proved that some widows know secrets that can move mountains, and some communities are built on foundations stronger than any corporate empire. Thanks for joining me in the hidden tunnels and secret chambers beneath Cedar Ridge, where truth really does find its level, like water seeking low ground, and where one Irish family's preparation and courage change the future of an entire territory. Until next time, keep digging for the truth, and never underestimate the power of people who plan for the long term and fight for what's right.